I always knew my mother-in-law Vivienne would find some way to belittle me during the annual Westbrook Thanksgiving dinner, but I never imagined she'd call me a worthless gold digger in front of the entire family moments before my late grandmother's attorney announced my $80 million inheritance. Sometimes the most painful insults come right before life changes everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra, special for you. Everyone thinks inheriting a fortune solves all your problems, but money doesn't erase the sting of being told you're not good enough by the people who are supposed to become your family. For 5 years, I had tried everything to gain the Westbrooks' approval, volunteering for their charitable foundation, dressing in the designer clothes they deemed appropriate, even putting my own career dreams on hold to support my husband Blake's position in the family investment firm. Nothing was ever enough. The Westbrooks weren't just wealthy. They were fourth-generation old money with a family compound in the Hamptons and their name on university buildings. I was Madeline Cooper, daughter of a high school music teacher and a nurse who'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through state college. Blake and I had met at a charity gala where I was working as an event coordinator, not attending as a guest. Our connection had been immediate and genuine, but from the moment he introduced me to his family, I was categorized as an outsider, a social climber, someone who could never truly belong in their world. "Darling, you have interesting taste," Vivienne would say when I wore something from a department store rather than her preferred boutiques. Or, "How quaint that you still use your state college connections," when I mentioned former classmates who had gone on to impressive careers. The comments were always delivered with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes, always carefully constructed to maintain plausible deniability if I ever called out their cruelty. Blake's father, Harrison, was less subtle. "The Westbrook men have always married strategically," he'd announced at our engagement dinner, glass of 30-year-old scotch in hand. "Blake appears to be breaking tradition." Then he'd laughed as if he'd made a harmless joke rather than questioning the entire foundation of our relationship. Only Blake's younger sister Eliza showed me any genuine warmth, perhaps because she too felt like an outsider, having chosen environmental law over the family business. "Just give them time," she'd counsel me during particularly difficult family gatherings. "They're set in their ways, but they'll eventually see what Blake sees in you." But after 5 years of marriage, their acceptance seemed increasingly unlikely. If anything, their disdain had grown more pronounced as it became clear I wasn't going to conveniently disappear from their son's life. The fact that we hadn't yet produced the expected Westbrook heir only added to their disappointment. None of this was made easier by the fact that my own family support system had dwindled dramatically over those same years. My father had passed away suddenly from a heart attack the year after our wedding. My mother, devastated by his loss, had retreated into a grief that eventually manifested as early-onset dementia, now requiring round-the-clock care in a specialized facility. My only sibling, my brother David, lived abroad managing humanitarian projects, our contact limited to occasional video calls bridging multiple time zones. And then there was Grandma Eleanor, my mother's mother, who had been my rock, my confidant, the one person who always made me feel that I was enough exactly as I was. She had lived modestly in a small New England coastal town, her weathered cottage filled with books and art collected over decades of what she called her quiet adventures. We'd spoken weekly by phone, her wisdom and unconditional love sustaining me through the coldest Westbrook family gatherings. When she passed away 3 months ago at 92, it felt like losing my last true ally. The Westbrooks had attended her funeral, of course. Appearances were everything to them, but their condolences had the hollow ring of social obligation rather than genuine sympathy. Vivienne had even managed to comment on the charming simplicity of the service, as if Eleanor's life warranted nothing more elaborate. In the weeks following the funeral, I'd been so consumed by grief that I barely registered the calls from Eleanor's attorney, Mr. Abernathy, an elderly man with thick glasses and an even thicker Maine accent. Something about settling the estate and important matters to discuss. I'd assured him I'd come to his office after the holidays, assuming it was about Eleanor's cottage and her modest savings, which I expected she'd left to be divided between my mother, my brother, and me. Which brings me to last Thursday, Thanksgiving Day, and the moment that would upend not just my place within the Westbrook family, but my entire understanding of who my grandmother had been. The day had begun with the usual tension, Blake and I driving the 2 hours to the Westbrook family, estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a sprawling colonial revival mansion set on 10 manicured acres. I'd spent the morning helping in the kitchen, not because the professional staff needed assistance, but because it gave me something useful to do and kept me away from Vivienne's critical gaze. "Remember, it's just one day," Blake had whispered, encouragingly as we'd arrived, squeezing my hand. "We'll make an appearance, eat some turkey, and be back home by 9. He meant well, always trying to shield me from his family's worst behavior. But he also consistently underestimated his mother's capacity for cruelty and his father's talent for condescension. I'd nodded, squared my shoulders, and pasted on what I privately called my Westbrook smile. Pleasant, unobtrusive, revealing nothing of my true thoughts. It was the expression I'd perfected over 5 years of enduring family gatherings where I was simultaneously present and invisible. What I couldn't have known then was that this particular Thanksgiving would be different from all the others. Before dessert was served, Vivienne Westbrook would finally say out loud what she'd been implying for years. That her carefully cultivated veneer of aristocratic restraint would crack, revealing the raw contempt beneath. That my late grandmother's secrets would come to light in the most dramatic way possible, and that I would finally stop trying to belong where I was never wanted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What happened next changed not just that day, but the entire power dynamic of our family forever. But before I tell you how my world turned upside down at that Thanksgiving table, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you that shows what happened 1 year after this life-changing moment. The Westbrook Thanksgiving tradition was less about gratitude and more about performance. Every element was orchestrated to project an image of perfect family unity and prosperity. The dining room itself was a stage set for this annual production. 20-foot coffered ceilings, hand-painted silk wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes, and a mahogany table that could comfortably seat 30. It had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. Family members and selected guests played their assigned roles with practiced precision. Harrison at the head of the table, carving the heritage turkey raised on some exclusive farm in Vermont. Vivienne at the opposite end, directing the household staff with subtle gestures and pointed glances. Blake's older brother Preston and his perfectly polished wife Camille positioned prominently, their twin daughters in matching dresses that probably cost more than my monthly student loan payment. And then there was me, seated as far from the center of power as possible while still technically being at the family table. This year, I found myself between Blake's second cousin, twice removed, an elderly gentleman who was mostly deaf and kept asking me to pass the cranberry sauce that was nowhere near us, and an empty chair that should have held Eliza, who had texted that morning that her flight from Seattle was delayed. "Such a shame Eliza couldn't make it back in time," Vivienne remarked as the first course was served, a butternut squash soup garnished with truffle oil and microgreens. "Though I suppose environmental lawyers can't always control their schedules. Not like investment banking, where reliability is paramount." The comment was ostensibly about Eliza, but the sidelong glance at me made it clear who the actual target was. I'd once made the mistake of mentioning my dream of opening a community arts center in our neighborhood, offering classes and exhibition space to emerging artists from disadvantaged backgrounds. Vivienne had acted as if I'd suggested opening a circus tent in her garden. Since then, my career aspirations had become another weapon in her arsenal of disapproval. "Actually," Blake interjected, "Eliza's flight should land in an hour. She'll be joining us for dessert." "How lovely," Vivienne replied without enthusiasm. "Perhaps Madeline can wait to serve her portion until then. I'm sure you wouldn't mind, dear, since you're closest to the kitchen door." And there it was, the subtle reminder of my place in the hierarchy. The implication that I was closer to staff than family. Blake caught my eye across the table, his expression apologetic. I gave him the smallest nod. It wasn't worth creating a scene over something so trivial. These paper cuts of disrespect were so common I'd developed calluses. Dinner progressed, through its choreographed courses. The conversation followed familiar patterns. Preston's latest acquisition for the family firm, Camille's work on the hospital board, Harrison's golf game with a former Treasury secretary. Occasionally, someone would direct a polite question my way, usually about Blake or about how my mother was doing in that facility. I provided the expected responses, the pleasant non-answers that wouldn't disrupt the performance. Yes, Blake was working incredibly hard. Yes, the care home was excellent. No, there hadn't been much improvement in my mother's condition. What I didn't say was how Blake had been questioning his role at Westbrook Financial, coming home later and later, the light in his eyes dimming with each passing month. I didn't mention how I visited my mother 3 times a week, reading to her from her favorite poetry collections, though she rarely recognized me anymore. I certainly didn't bring up how the medical bills were straining our finances, despite Blake's generous salary. These truths had no place at the Westbrook Thanksgiving table. By the time the main course was cleared, I had almost made it through. Another successful performance, meaning I had neither cried nor told anyone what I really thought of them. Just dessert and coffee to go. Then the socially acceptable departure time would arrive, and Blake and I could retreat to our apartment in the city, kick off our uncomfortable formal shoes, and eat leftover pizza in bed while watching terrible reality TV. It was my favorite Thanksgiving tradition, our private antidote to the Westbrook pageantry. But then Harrison tapped his crystal water glass with a silver spoon, the delicate ring silencing the table conversation. "Before dessert is served," he announced, "we have some family business to discuss." He nodded toward an older gentleman sitting near him, someone I'd been introduced to, but whose name I couldn't recall. "As you know, year-end distributions are approaching, and there have been some developments regarding the family trust that we should address." My attention drifted slightly. Financial discussions at the Westbrook table inevitably excluded me, explicitly or implicitly. I was mentally calculating how soon we could leave when I heard my name. "Which brings us to the question of Blake and Madeline," Harrison was saying, his tone shifting to something cooler. "Son, the board has some concerns about your recent investment proposals. The focus on sustainable businesses and social impact is admirable in theory, but the returns simply don't justify the allocation of significant capital." Blake straightened in his chair. "The projections show competitive returns over a 7-year horizon and the reduced environmental risk factors." "We've been over this," Harrison interrupted. "Westbrook Financial has a fiduciary responsibility to our clients. We can't reshape our investment strategy around your wife's idealistic influences." I felt heat rising to my cheeks. Blake had been working on that sustainable investment division for months, staying up late researching companies and building financial models. The implication that it was somehow my fault, my idealistic influence that was causing problems, was both unfair and unsurprising. "My investment recommendations are based on solid market analysis," Blake replied, his voice tight. "And they represent where the industry is heading, whether Westbrook wants to lead or follow." I could see the tendons in his neck straining against his collar. This wasn't just about investments. It was about his growing desire to align his work with his values. values that had strengthened during our marriage, but had always been part of him, buried beneath layers of Westbrook expectations. The tension around the table was thickening, the carefully maintained veneer of family harmony beginning to crack. It was into this charged atmosphere that Mr. Abernathy would soon enter, carrying a leather portfolio containing documents that would change everything. But first, Vivienne Westbrook would finally say out loud what she had been implying for 5 long years. "Perhaps," Vivienne said into the tense silence, her voice carrying that particular blend of refinement and ice that she had perfected over decades of social dominance. "This is a perfect example of why we've always emphasized the importance of marrying within certain circles." She took a deliberate sip of her wine, a rare Montrachet that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. When spouses come from similar backgrounds, they understand the responsibilities that accompany wealth. They don't try to redirect resources toward impractical passions. The implication was clear. I was the problem. The outsider who didn't understand the Westbrook way, who was corrupting Blake with idealism and social consciousness that had no place in their world of calculated returns and generational wealth. Blake's face flushed. "Mother, that's completely—" No, I'm simply making an observation," Vivienne continued, waving her hand dismissively. "After all, it's only natural that Madeline would have different priorities." Given her background, she couldn't possibly comprehend the complexities of wealth management or the obligations that come with a legacy like ours. 5 years ago, when Blake had first brought me to this same dining room to announce our engagement, I had been intimidated by Vivienne. I'd spent hours researching proper etiquette, memorizing the correct usage of the bewildering array of silverware that accompanied formal dining, practicing how to speak about art and literature in ways that would demonstrate I wasn't completely uncultured despite my public school education. I had genuinely believed that if I tried hard enough, learned enough, adapted enough, they would eventually accept me. That underneath their initial reservations was the potential for real connection. That naive hope had eroded gradually, weathered away by 1,000 small cruelties and dismissals. The time Vivienne had forgotten to include me in the family. Photo at Preston and Camille's anniversary celebration. The Christmas Harrison had given everyone personalized gifts except me. I'd received a generic scarf with the price tag still attached. The way conversations would subtly shift to topics that excluded me whenever I joined a group at family gatherings. In the beginning, Blake had defended me fiercely, confronting his parents about their behavior. But over time, exhaustion had set in. He'd started encouraging me to let it go and rise above it, assuring me that his parents were simply set in their ways and would come around eventually. It was easier for him to believe that than to accept that the people who had raised him were deliberately cruel to the woman he loved. And I had gone along with it, swallowing my pride and my hurt, telling myself that maintaining peace was more important than demanding respect. Besides, I had Grandma Eleanor to confide in during our weekly calls, her wisdom keeping me grounded when the Westbrook reality threatened to make me doubt my own worth. "Remember, Maddie," she would say in that voice like warm honey over gravel, "people who measure others by their bank accounts are using the wrong yardstick entirely. True wealth is in how you treat people who can do nothing for you." Eleanor had been my moral compass, the voice that reminded me that the Westbrooks' judgment reflected their limitations, not mine. She'd grown up during the Depression, worked as a school librarian for 40 years, and raised my mother alone after my grandfather died young. Her life had been defined by service, generosity, and quiet dignity, values that found little currency at the Westbrook table. When Eleanor passed away in her sleep 3 months ago, I'd felt unmoored. The funeral had been small, held in the community church where she'd sung in the choir for decades. Her friends had shared stories about her kindness, her wry humor, the way she'd quietly paid for college textbooks for students who couldn't afford them. The Westbrooks had stood awkwardly at the back of the church, overdressed and visibly uncomfortable among Eleanor's modest community. Afterward, they'd declined to attend the reception at her neighbor's house, citing a previous commitment. Blake had stayed with me, of course, but their absence had spoken volumes about how they viewed my family connections, as obligations to be minimally fulfilled rather than relationships to be honored. In the weeks following Eleanor's death, I'd been surprised by how many of her former students and colleagues had reached out with stories about her influence on their lives. She'd apparently been something of a legend in the coastal town of Windermere, Maine, the librarian who went beyond recommending books to champion children who needed an advocate, sometimes providing quiet financial assistance for college applications or emergency needs. I'd known she was well respected, but I hadn't realized the breadth of her impact. It had made me wonder how many other aspects of her life I might have missed or misunderstood. Eleanor had never spoken much about money or her early life before becoming a librarian. She'd lived simply in her weathered cottage with its overflowing bookshelves and garden that tumbled almost to the edge of the sea, when Mr. Abernathy, her attorney, had called about matters of significance regarding Eleanor's estate. I'd assumed it was about the cottage and perhaps some modest savings. I'd been so consumed by grief, by the effort of supporting my mother through another loss she couldn't fully comprehend, by the crushing weight of the Westbrook holiday expectations, that I hadn't given his calls the attention they perhaps deserved. And now, sitting at this table under the weight of Vivienne's disdain, I found myself wishing more than ever for Eleanor's steadying presence, her perspective that could cut through the superficial to what truly mattered. "I think what Vivienne means," Harrison interjected, clearly trying to soften his wife's statement while essentially agreeing with it, "is that different family cultures have different values. The Westbrook approach to wealth has been refined over generations. It's not something that can be intuited without proper exposure." I watched Blake's jaw tighten, the muscle pulsing beneath his skin. He'd been increasingly torn between the family expectations and his own evolving values. The Sustainable Investment Division had been his attempt to bridge those worlds, to bring the Westbrook resources to bear on companies that were both profitable and purposeful. Now it was being dismissed not on its merits, but because of its perceived connection to me and my supposedly unsophisticated understanding of wealth. "I'm not sure this is an appropriate discussion for Thanksgiving dinner," Blake said, his voice controlled but strained. "My investment proposals stand on their own financial projections. They have nothing to do with my marriage." "Oh, darling," Vivienne laughed lightly. "Everything has to do with who we choose to marry. The Westbrooks have always understood that. Your great-grandfather famously said that marriage is the most important merger a person will ever negotiate." The table fell, uncomfortably silent. Even Preston looked slightly embarrassed by his mother's lack of subtlety. It was into this crackling tension that the butler appeared, bending to murmur something in Harrison's ear. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, and he checked his watch. "It seems we have an unexpected visitor," he announced with evident irritation at the disruption to his carefully orchestrated evening. "Mr. Abernathy, Eleanor Cooper's attorney, is here and insists on speaking with Madeline immediately on a matter he describes as urgent." "Mr. Abernathy?" I repeated, surprised to hear my grandmother's attorney mentioned in this setting. "He came all the way from Maine? Today?" Harrison's expression conveyed his displeasure at this disruption to his carefully controlled family dinner. "Apparently so. He's waiting in the library. He was most insistent that the matter couldn't wait, despite my suggestion that you could." "Call him tomorrow." Vivienne's lips thinned to a nearly invisible line. How extraordinarily inconsiderate to arrive unannounced on Thanksgiving. "I suppose he doesn't understand that civilized people have schedules and traditions." Her words reinforced what she'd been implying about my background all evening, that my people were somehow less civilized than the Westbrooks, lacking their refined understanding of proper behavior. Under normal circumstances, I might have apologized for the interruption, taking on guilt that wasn't mine to shoulder. But something about the timing, Mr. Abernathy, appearing just as Vivienne was at her most explicitly contemptuous, gave me a strange sense of calm. "I should speak with him," I said, rising from the table and placing my napkin beside my barely touched plate. "Please continue with dessert. I won't be long." Blake started to stand as well. "I'll come with you." "Actually," I said, surprising myself with my certainty, "I think I should speak with him alone first. This is about my grandmother's estate." Blake hesitated, then nodded, respecting my decision, though concern lingered in his eyes. As I turned to leave, I caught Vivienne exchanging a meaningful glance with Harrison, probably assuming this interruption was about some paltry financial matter, perhaps debts I was embarrassed to have revealed in front of the family. The Westbrook Library was a 2-story affair with leather-bound volumes arranged by color rather than content, books as decoration rather than sources of knowledge or pleasure. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, while floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the immaculately landscaped gardens, now shrouded in evening darkness. Mr. Abernathy stood examining a pretentious oil painting of Harrison's father on horseback, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned as I entered, and I was struck again by how he seemed out of place in this formal setting with his rumpled tweed jacket and sensible shoes, his thick glasses slightly askew on his nose. "Ms. Cooper? I mean Mrs. Westbrook," he corrected himself, stepping forward to shake my hand. "Thank you for seeing me. I apologize for the intrusion on a family holiday." "It's Madeline, please," I said, finding comfort in his plain-spoken manner, after the strained politeness of the dinner table. "Is everything all right? You came all this way on Thanksgiving." "I'm afraid the matter couldn't wait any longer." He gestured to a leather portfolio he'd placed on a side table. "I've been trying to reach you for several weeks. When my calls went unanswered, I took the liberty of tracking you down through your brother." Guilt washed over me. I had been avoiding his calls, unable to face the finality of settling Eleanor's affairs. Each call had felt like another severance of my connection to her. "I'm sorry," I said sincerely. "After the funeral, it was difficult to—" "No need to explain," he interrupted gently. "Grief has its own timeline, but there are matters regarding Eleanor's estate that simply cannot be delayed any further, particularly given certain time-sensitive elements." He retrieved the portfolio and guided me to a pair of leather chairs near the fireplace. "I had hoped to discuss this in a more private setting, but when your brother told me you would be here, I realized this might be my only opportunity before the filing deadlines." "Filing deadlines?" I echoed, confused. How complicated could Eleanor's modest estate be? Mr. Abernathy removed his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief, a gesture that reminded me painfully of Eleanor, who had the same habit when gathering her thoughts. "Madeline," he began, replacing his glasses and looking at me directly, "how much did your grandmother tell you about her life before she moved to Windermere?" The question caught me off guard. Not much, honestly. I know she was born in Boston, that she met my grandfather while they were both in college, and that after he died, she moved to Windermere for the librarian position because it came with housing, the cottage. "She raised my mother there." Mr. Abernathy nodded slowly. "That's the narrative Eleanor preferred to present. It was simpler, less complicated, but it wasn't the complete truth." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "What do you mean?" "Your grandmother wasn't originally Eleanor Cooper. She was born Eleanor Blackwell of the Massachusetts Blackwells. The name meant nothing to me, and my expression must have conveyed as much. The Blackwells were one of the wealthiest families in New England," Mr. Abernathy explained. "Shipping initially, then railroads, banking, and eventually technology. Eleanor was their only daughter and, at one time, sole heir to the Blackwell fortune." I stared at him, struggling to reconcile this information with my image of Grandma Eleanor in her gardening clothes, soil under her fingernails, reading glasses perched on her head as she recommended obscure poetry to teenage students. "That can't be right," I said, shaking my head. Grandma lived so simply. The cottage, her used car, the clothes she made herself. Those were choices she made after leaving her family, he explained. When Eleanor fell in love with your grandfather, a teacher with no family connections or fortune, her parents threatened to disinherit her if she married him. She chose love over money and was indeed cut off from the family wealth. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes. This was a side of Eleanor I had never known, a depth of courage and conviction I hadn't recognized, though it aligned perfectly with the grandmother I had loved. After your grandfather died, Mr. Abernathy continued, Eleanor's parents attempted a reconciliation, offering to welcome her back into the family fold if she would return to Boston and assume certain social obligations. She refused, choosing instead to raise your mother in Windermere, away from what she called the suffocating expectations of wealth. He opened the portfolio, removing a document bound in blue leather. However, Eleanor's parents never formally removed her from their will. When they died within months of each other some 40 years ago, their estate went into a trust with extremely specific conditions. My mind was spinning, trying to process this revelation about the grandmother I thought I had known completely. What kind of conditions? The Blackwell fortune was placed in a trust that would remain sealed until Eleanor's death. At that time, the entirety would pass to her direct descendants, your mother, you, and your brother, provided certain criteria were met. A knock at the library door interrupted us. Blake entered, his expression concerned. Everything okay in here? You've been gone for almost 20 minutes. I hadn't realized so much time had passed. Blake, this is Mr. Abernathy, my grandmother's attorney. He's telling me about her family. Apparently, she came from significant wealth that I never knew about. Blake's eyebrows rose as he joined us, perching on the arm of my chair in a gesture of support. Really? Eleanor? She seemed so unassuming, Mr. Abernathy supplied with a small smile. Yes, that was by design. She chose a different path from the one her family had planned for her. So, what happens now? I asked, returning to the matter at hand. With this trust? Mr. Abernathy glanced at his watch, then at the library door. Actually, there's something rather unusual about the trust provisions. The Blackwells stipulated that the existence and contents of the trust must be announced publicly to all family members of the inheritors at the same time. Publicly? Blake asked, his legal training, making him immediately alert to unusual stipulations. For what purpose? The Blackwells were quite strategic, Mr. Abernathy replied. They believed that wealth should be acknowledged openly to prevent manipulation or false pretenses. The trust executor, which is now me, is required to make a formal announcement to family members of the heirs. A cold realization washed over me. You mean the Westbrooks? Today? Mr. Abernathy nodded solemnly. I'm afraid so. The trust specifies that once the executor has located the heirs, the announcement must be made at the earliest possible gathering of family members. When I learned you would all be together today, I had no choice but to come. But that means, Blake began. It means, I finished, my voice barely above a whisper, that whatever is in that trust will be announced to your entire family. Tonight, in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. Oh God, Blake muttered, running a hand through his hair. My mother is already in rare form tonight. This is going to be dramatic, I supplied, an inappropriate bubble of laughter rising in my throat. The sheer absurdity of the situation momentarily overshadowing the shock of these revelations. Perhaps we should return to the dining room, Mr. Abernathy suggested, gathering his papers. They'll be wondering what's keeping you, and I'm afraid I must insist on fulfilling my legal obligations tonight. As we stood to leave, Blake leaned in close to my ear. Whatever happens next, remember that I loved you when I thought you had nothing. That won't change if it turns out you have something. His words warmed me. But as we made our way back toward the dining room, I couldn't help wondering how the rest of his family would react. The Westbrooks, who had judged me for my perceived lack of pedigree and resources, were about to learn that I might have a family legacy older and possibly more substantial than their own. And Vivienne, who had just finished explaining why people should marry within their social class, was about to discover exactly which social class I might actually belong to. As we approached the dining room, I could hear the lilting notes of Vivienne's practiced social laugh, the one she reserved for moments when she wanted to appear carefree and gracious. The sound sent a familiar ripple of tension up my spine, a conditioned response after years of experiencing what often followed that particular laugh. "Just a moment," I said, stopping Blake and Mr. Abernathy in the hallway. My heart was racing, my thoughts scrambling to process everything I'd just learned. "I need a second to breathe." Blake squeezed my hand. "We can delay this, you know. There's no reason it has to happen tonight, in the middle of an already tense dinner." Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat apologetically. "I'm afraid the terms of the trust are quite specific about timing. Once the executor has located the heirs and a family gathering is taking place, the announcement must be made within 24 hours. But surely the specifics of the trust could remain private," Blake pressed, his legal mind searching for a loophole. "You could simply announce the existence of an inheritance without going into dollar amounts or details." "I'm sorry, but no," Mr. Abernathy replied, his voice gentle but firm. The Blackwells were extraordinarily explicit about transparency. They believed that hidden wealth created unhealthy family dynamics. A slight smile crossed his face. "Eleanor often said her parents were wrong about many things, but right about that." I took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of my dress, a simple navy sheath that had been the most expensive item in my closet until Blake had insisted on buying. Me, a proper Westbrook-appropriate wardrobe when we married. Even now, 5 years later, I felt like I was wearing a costume in these clothes, playing a part I'd never quite mastered. "All right," I said finally. "Let's get this over with." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, please subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. We re-entered the dining room to find dessert already served, individual pumpkin soufflés with spun sugar decorations, a signature creation of the private chef Vivienne hired for special occasions. All heads turned toward us, expressions ranging from mild curiosity, the more distant relatives, to barely concealed annoyance, Vivienne, to genuine concern, Eliza, who had apparently arrived while we were in the library. "Ah, Madeline returns." "At last," Vivienne said, her tone suggesting I had deliberately timed my absence to disrupt her carefully planned dinner. "We've started dessert, I'm afraid. Soufflés wait for no one." "I apologize for the interruption," I replied automatically, years of conditioning making the words emerge before I could stop them. Harrison's gaze fixed on Mr. Abernathy, who stood slightly behind us with his portfolio clutched to his chest. "And will your visitor be joining us?" The emphasis on visitor made it clear that uninvited guests were a breach of protocol only slightly less offensive than showing up naked. "Actually," Blake said before I could respond, stepping forward with the confidence that came from a lifetime of belonging in these rooms, "this is Mr. Abernathy, the executor of Eleanor Cooper's estate. He has official business that concerns our family." I watched a flicker of calculation cross Harrison's face, likely weighing the disruption against the potential for embarrassment if he refused what was clearly legal business. Social appearances would win, as they always did with the Westbrooks. "I see," Harrison said finally. "Well, under the circumstances, perhaps you'd care to join us, Mr. Abernathy. Thomas, please set another place." "That won't be necessary," Mr. Abernathy replied with a calm that suggested he was unimpressed by the Westbrook grandeur. "I won't be staying long. I simply need to fulfill my legal obligations regarding the Blackwell Trust." "Blackwell?" Vivienne repeated, her perfect eyebrows drawing together in confusion. I thought this concerned the Cooper estate. That's part of what I need to explain, Mr. Abernathy said, moving to stand at the end of the table where everyone could see him. I took my seat beside Blake, acutely aware of every eye in the room. Eliza reached across the table to squeeze my hand briefly, a silent gesture of support, though she couldn't possibly understand what was happening. Her flight must have landed early, and I was selfishly grateful for her presence. She had always been the one Westbrook who treated me with genuine warmth. Before Mr. Abernathy begins, Blake said, his voice carrying the authority that came naturally to him in professional settings, I want to be clear that whatever he's about to share doesn't change anything about Madeline's place in this family, or our marriage. The statement, clearly directed at his parents, brought a slight flush to Vivienne's cheeks. I felt a surge of love for Blake, who might sometimes fail to stand up to his family in the moment, but always found his way back to what mattered. Of course not, Harrison replied smoothly, though his eyes had narrowed with suspicion. Though, I must say this all sounds rather theatrical. Mr. Abernathy adjusted his glasses and opened his portfolio. I'll be as concise as possible. I'm here in my capacity as executor of the Blackwell Family Trust, established in 1975 by Howard and Margaret Blackwell of Boston, Massachusetts. He glanced around the table, noting the spark of recognition from some of the older family members at the mention of the Blackwell name. Eleanor Cooper, born Eleanor Blackwell, was the only child of Howard and Margaret. Though she was estranged from her family for most of her adult life, she remained the primary beneficiary of the Blackwell Trust, which has been held in abeyance until her death. Preston leaned forward, suddenly interested. As the financial strategist of the Westbrook clan, he clearly recognized the implications. The Blackwells of Mass Mutual? That Blackwell family? The same, Mr. Abernathy confirmed with a nod. Howard Blackwell was a founding partner, though the family's wealth predated that venture by several generations. A ripple of murmurs circled the table. The Blackwell name carried weight in East Coast financial circles, not flashy new money, but old, established wealth that had multiplied quietly through strategic investments and connections. Vivienne's expression had shifted from annoyance to something more calculating. I could almost see her reassessing everything she thought she knew about me, about my background, about my place in her carefully ordered social hierarchy. As stipulated in the trust documents, Mr. Abernathy continued, upon Eleanor's death, the entirety of the Blackwell estate passes to her direct descendants, which are her daughter, Margaret Cooper, and her grandchildren, David and Madeline Cooper. He nodded toward me, and I felt a strange disconnection, as if this were happening to someone else. This couldn't be real. My grandmother, the school librarian who darned her own socks and bought books at yard sales, secretly the disinherited daughter of a banking fortune? Given Margaret Cooper's current medical condition, Mr. Abernathy continued, his voice gentle as he referenced my mother's dementia, her portion will be held in a specialized medical trust for her care. David Cooper has already been informed of his inheritance and has provided instructions for his portion. Harrison's businessman instincts clearly overrode his sense of propriety. And the approximate value of this trust? He asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Mr. Abernathy looked directly at me rather than Harrison as he answered, his kind eyes communicating that this information was rightfully mine, not theirs. The current valuation of the Blackwell Trust, inclusive of all properties, investments, and holdings, stands at approximately $80 million. Madeline's portion, after allocations for her mother's care and her brother's share, amounts to just over $47 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual soft clink of silverware against fine china ceased. I stared at Mr. Abernathy, certain I had misheard. $47 million? It was an incomprehensible number, so far beyond my experience, that it seemed abstract, unreal. I looked at Blake, who whose expression mirrored my shock. This wasn't just money. It was the kind of wealth that changed everything, that reshaped possibilities and rebalanced power. The kind of wealth the Westbrooks respected above all else. And it was at that precise moment, as the reality began to sink in, that Vivienne Westbrook made the most catastrophic social miscalculation of her life. "Well," Vivienne said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence with a brittle laugh, "I suppose this explains why you've been so secretive about your little meetings with the lawyer. Planning to surprise us all along, weren't you?" Her tone carried an unmistakable implication that I had somehow engineered this inheritance announcement to coincide with her dinner, that I had orchestrated this entire scenario as some sort of power play. "Mother," Blake warned, but Vivienne was already continuing, the wine she'd consumed throughout dinner perhaps loosening her usual careful self-control. "It certainly puts your marriage in a different light, doesn't it?" She directed this to the table at large, as if inviting them all to join her in this new narrative she was constructing in real time. "How convenient that Eleanor kept this fortune secret until after you'd secured your position in our family." My mouth fell open at the accusation. "I had no idea about any of this," I said, hearing the defensive note in my voice and hating it. "This is as much a shock to me as it is to you." "Of course you'd say that," Vivienne replied with a dismissive wave. "But it does seem rather calculated. The modest granddaughter routine, the public school teacher background, the thrift shop, clothes when we first met you, all very convincing. And now, just as Blake is pushing for changes at the firm that the board is resistant to, suddenly there's a mysterious fortune to back his play." Harrison placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely discounting her theory. The Westbrooks viewed everything through the lens of strategic advantage. They couldn't conceive of wealth that wasn't wielded deliberately for power or position. "Mrs. Westbrook," Mr. Abernathy interjected, his main accent more pronounced as he addressed Vivienne directly. "I can assure you that Madeline had no knowledge of her inheritance prior to this evening. Eleanor was quite specific about maintaining secrecy until after her death." "And we're just supposed to take your word for that?" Vivienne countered, turning her sharp gaze to the attorney. "For all we know, you could be in collusion with her." Even Preston looked uncomfortable at this accusation. "Mother, that's a serious allegation to make against a legal professional," he cautioned. "It's all right," Mr. Abernathy said calmly. "I understand this comes as a significant surprise. For what it's worth, I have documentation confirming that Madeline was never informed of the trust's existence before today. Eleanor was quite methodical about record-keeping." He withdrew another document from his portfolio. "Including this letter, which she instructed me to deliver to Madeline once the announcement was made." He handed me a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Eleanor's familiar slanted handwriting. The sight of it, knowing these words, were among the last she'd intended for me, made my throat tighten with emotion. "This is ridiculous," Vivienne continued, seemingly unable to stop herself. "We're expected to believe that a woman worth millions lived in a run-down cottage in Maine, working as a librarian? That she never once mentioned this fortune to her only granddaughter?" "That's exactly what she did," Mr. Abernathy confirmed. "Eleanor Blackwell Cooper rejected her family's wealth and the lifestyle it represented. She chose a different set of values to live by and to pass on to her family." "How convenient," Vivienne said with another brittle laugh. "And now those values include $47 million. "Mother, that's enough," Blake said, his voice carrying an authority I rarely heard him use with his parents. "You're being incredibly disrespectful, both to Madeline and to her grandmother's memory." "Disrespectful?" Vivienne repeated, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "I think we're the ones who deserve respect here. We welcomed Madeline into our family, introduced her to our social circle, helped her learn how to dress and behave appropriately in our world, and all while she was hiding this secret identity." "I wasn't hiding anything," I said, finding my voice at last. I knew my grandmother as a school librarian who taught me to love books and to judge people by their character, not their bank accounts. That's who she was to me. The rest of this is as much a revelation to me as it is to you." "Please," Vivienne scoffed. "Next, you'll be telling us you don't plan to use this money to influence Blake's position at the firm." Blake pushed back his chair, the scrape against the hardwood floor startlingly loud in the tense dining room. "Mother, I need you to stop right now. You're making unfounded accusations against my wife based on nothing but your own insecurity." "Insecurity?" Vivienne's voice rose an octave. "I have nothing to be insecure about. The Westbrooks have been a respected name in finance for 4 generations. And the Blackwells for 6, Mr. Abernathy added quietly, almost apologetically. Their shipping fortune predates the Revolutionary War. This additional information landed like a grenade at the table. The Westbrooks prided themselves on their historic pedigree, their place among the oldest money in Connecticut. The idea that I, whom they had treated as a social climber, might actually come from an even more established lineage seemed to physically pain Vivienne. "This doesn't change anything," she declared, though her tone suggested it changed everything. "Money can't buy class or breeding. It can't erase the fact that Madeline has never truly fit into our world, that she's always been different." "Vivienne," Harrison cautioned, clearly sensing that his wife was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "Perhaps we should all take a moment to digest this unexpected news." "No, Harrison, I think we need to be honest here," Vivienne continued, ignoring his attempt to rein her in. "We've spent 5 years making allowances, trying to help Madeline, adapt to our standards, overlooking her deficiencies because we thought she came from nothing and needed our guidance." Each word landed like a physical blow. All the suspicions I'd had about how the Westbrooks truly saw me, as a charity case, a project, someone to be tolerated rather than embraced, were being confirmed in the most brutal way possible. "And now we discover it was all an act," Vivienne continued, fully committed to her narrative. "The humble background, the wide-eyed gratitude for being included in our circle. While all along she was actually a Blackwell heiress, probably laughing at our efforts to civilize her." "Mother," Eliza exclaimed, breaking her shocked silence. "Do you even hear yourself?" But Vivienne was beyond caution now, years of carefully veiled disdain spilling out in a torrent of unfiltered contempt. "Let's be completely honest for once," she said, her gaze fixed on me like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "You've never belonged here, Madeline. Not because you lacked money, as it turns out, but because you lacked the fundamental understanding of how our world works. You've been playing at being a Westbrook for 5 years, and you've never gotten it right. Not your clothes, not your conversation, not your social instincts. You've been a disappointment from the start, and finding out you're secretly rich doesn't change that fundamental worthlessness." The dining room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Even Vivienne seemed shocked by what had just emerged from her mouth, the naked ugliness of it hanging in the air between us. In that suspended moment, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. After 5 years of subtle put-downs and careful undermining of never quite measuring up to unspoken standards, Vivienne had finally said exactly what she thought of me. There was a certain relief in having it all out in the open, in no longer needing to pretend we were engaged in anything but mutual antipathy. I looked around the table, taking in the varied expressions. Harrison's tight-lipped disapproval, Preston's calculated neutrality, Eliza's mortified sympathy, and Blake. My Blake, whose face had gone completely white with shock at his mother's words. 5 years ago, I might have burst into tears. 3 years ago, I might have apologized somehow, taking on guilt that wasn't mine. A year ago, I might have simply left the table in dignified silence. But tonight, with Eleanor's letter in my hand and the knowledge of who she had been, a woman who had chosen love and principle over wealth and status, I found a clarity and strength I hadn't known I possessed. I carefully unfolded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and stood. When I spoke, my voice was steady and carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room. Thank you, Vivienne, for finally saying what you've always thought. Well, Vivienne said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence with a brittle laugh. I suppose this explains why you've been so secretive about your little meetings with the lawyer. Planning to surprise us all along, weren't you? Her tone carried an unmistakable implication that I had somehow engineered this inheritance announcement to coincide with her dinner, that I had orchestrated this entire scenario as some sort of power play. Mother, Blake warned, but Vivienne was already continuing, the wine she'd consumed throughout dinner perhaps loosening her usual careful self-control. It certainly puts your marriage in a different light, doesn't it? She directed this to the table at large, as if inviting them all to join her in this new narrative she was constructing in real time. How convenient that Eleanor kept this fortune secret until after you'd secured your position in our family. My mouth fell open at the accusation. I had no idea about any of this, I said, hearing the defensive note in my voice and hating it. This is as much a shock to me as it is to you. Of course you'd say that, Vivienne replied with a dismissive wave. But it does seem rather calculated. The modest granddaughter routine, the public school teacher background, the thrift shop, clothes when we first met you, all very convincing. And now, just as Blake is pushing for changes at the firm that the board is resistant to, suddenly there's a mysterious fortune to back his play. Harrison placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely discounting her theory. The Westbrooks viewed everything through the lens of strategic advantage. They couldn't conceive of wealth that wasn't wielded deliberately for power or position. Mrs. Westbrook, Mr. Abernathy interjected, his main accent more pronounced as he addressed Vivienne directly. I can assure you that Madeline had no knowledge of her inheritance prior to this evening. Eleanor was quite specific about maintaining secrecy until after her death. And we're just supposed to take your word for that? Vivienne countered, turning her sharp gaze to the attorney. For all we know, you could be in collusion with her. Even Preston looked uncomfortable at this accusation. Mother, that's a serious allegation to make against a legal professional, he cautioned. It's all right, Mr. Abernathy said calmly. I understand this comes as a significant surprise. For what it's worth, I have documentation confirming that Madeline was never informed of the trust's existence before today. Eleanor was quite methodical about record-keeping. He withdrew another document from his portfolio, including this letter, which she instructed me to deliver to Madeline once the announcement was made. He handed me a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Eleanor's familiar slanted handwriting. The sight of it, knowing these words, were among the last she'd intended for me, made my throat tighten with emotion. This is ridiculous, Vivienne continued, seemingly unable to stop herself. We're expected to believe that a woman worth millions lived in a rundown cottage in Maine, working as a librarian? That she never once mentioned this fortune to her only granddaughter? That's exactly what she did, Mr. Abernathy confirmed. Eleanor Blackwell Cooper rejected her family's wealth and the lifestyle it represented. She chose a different set of values to live by and to pass on to her family. How convenient, Vivienne said with another brittle laugh. And now those values include $47 million. Mother, that's enough, Blake said, his voice carrying an authority I rarely heard him use with his parents. You're being incredibly disrespectful, both to Madeline and to her grandmother's memory. Disrespectful? Vivienne repeated, her cheeks flushed with indignation. I think we're the ones who deserve respect here. We welcomed Madeline into our family, introduced her to our social circle, helped her learn how to dress and behave appropriately in our world, and all while she was hiding this secret identity. I wasn't hiding anything, I said, finding my voice at last. I knew my grandmother as a school librarian who taught me to love books and to judge people by their character, not their bank accounts. That's who she was to me. The rest of this is as much a revelation to me as it is to you." "Please," Vivienne scoffed. "Next, you'll be telling us you don't plan to use this money to influence Blake's position at the firm." Blake pushed back his chair, the scrape against the hardwood floor startlingly loud in the tense dining room. "Mother, I need you to stop right now. You're making unfounded accusations against my wife based on nothing but your own insecurity." "Insecurity?" Vivienne's voice rose an octave. "I have nothing to be insecure about. The Westbrooks have been a respected name in finance for 4 generations. And the Blackwells for 6, Mr. Abernathy added quietly, almost apologetically. Their shipping fortune predates the Revolutionary War." This additional information landed like a grenade at the table. The Westbrooks prided themselves on their historic pedigree, their place among the oldest money in Connecticut. The idea that I, whom they had treated as a social climber, might actually come from an even more established lineage seemed to physically pain Vivienne. "This doesn't change anything," she declared, though her tone suggested it changed everything. "Money can't buy class or breeding. It can't erase the fact that Madeline has never truly fit into our world, that she's always been different." "Vivienne," Harrison cautioned, clearly sensing that his wife was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "Perhaps we should all take a moment to digest this unexpected news." "No, Harrison, I think we need to be honest here," Vivienne continued, ignoring his attempt to rein her in. "We've spent 5 years making allowances, trying to help Madeline, adapt to our standards, overlooking her deficiencies because we thought she came from nothing and needed our guidance." Each word landed like a physical blow. All the suspicions I'd had about how the Westbrooks truly saw me, as a charity case, a project, someone to be tolerated rather than embraced, were being confirmed in the most brutal way possible. "And now, we discover it was all an act," Vivienne continued, fully committed to her narrative. "The humble background, the wide-eyed gratitude for being included in our circle, while all along she was actually a Blackwell heiress, probably laughing at our efforts to civilize her." "Mother!" Eliza exclaimed, breaking her shocked silence. "Do you even hear yourself?" But Vivienne was beyond caution now, years of carefully veiled disdain spilling out in a torrent of unfiltered contempt. "Let's be completely honest for once," she said, her gaze fixed on me like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "You've never belonged here, Madeline. Not because you lacked money, as it turns out, but because you lack the fundamental understanding of how our world works. You've been playing at being a Westbrook for 5 years, and you've never gotten it right. Not your clothes, not your conversation, not your social instincts. You've been a disappointment from the start, and finding out you're secretly rich doesn't change that fundamental worthlessness." The dining room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Even Vivienne seemed shocked by what had just emerged from her mouth, the naked ugliness of it hanging in the air between us. In that suspended moment, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. After 5 years of subtle put-downs and careful undermining of never quite measuring up to unspoken standards, Vivienne had finally said exactly what she thought of me. There was a certain relief in having it all out in the open, and no longer needing to pretend we were engaged in anything but mutual antipathy. I looked around the table, taking in the varied expressions, Harrison's tight-lipped disapproval, Preston's calculated neutrality, Eliza's mortified sympathy, and Blake, my Blake, whose face had gone completely white with shock at his mother's words. 5 years ago, I might have burst into tears. 3 years ago, I might have apologized somehow, taking on guilt that wasn't mine. A year ago, I might have simply left the table in dignified silence. But tonight, with Eleanor's letter in my hand and the knowledge of who she had been, a woman who had chosen love and principle over wealth and status, I found a clarity and strength I hadn't known I possessed. I carefully unfolded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and stood. When I spoke, my voice was steady and carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room. Thank you, Vivienne, for finally saying what you've always thought. The silence in the Westbrook dining room was so complete, you could hear the gentle ticking of Harrison's antique pocket watch. Every face was turned toward me, some shocked, some mortified, some calculating the new balance of power that had just been established. Blake stood beside me, his hand firm on the small of my back. I think we should leave, he said quietly. Before we could move. The dining room door opened and an elegantly dressed older woman entered, followed by a distinguished gentleman I didn't recognize. They both paused, clearly sensing the tension in the room. Catherine, Harrison said, rising quickly. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow. The woman, apparently Blake's Aunt Catherine, who I'd heard mentioned but never met, surveyed the scene with a shrewd gaze. Clearly our timing is impeccable, she said dryly. We caught an earlier flight from Paris. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Not at all, Harrison replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. We're just having a family discussion. So I gathered, Catherine replied, her gaze settling on me. You must be Madeline. I've heard so much about you. All of it carefully curated, I'm sure, I replied, finding unexpected confidence in this strange moment of transition. A smile flickered across Catherine's face. Undoubtedly. She turned to the still-seated Vivienne. Hello, sister-in-law. Still maintaining your iron grip on family narratives, I see. Vivienne's lips tightened. Catherine, how unexpected. I thought you had sworn never to set foot in this house again. Times change, Catherine replied with a casual shrug that belied the intensity of her gaze. And sometimes old secrets need addressing. The gentleman who had entered with Catherine stepped forward. I apologize for interrupting. Your Thanksgiving dinner. I'm Jonathan Palmer, attorney for Catherine Westbrook. Harrison's expression shifted from annoyed to alarmed. Whatever legal matters you have with Catherine can surely wait until after the holiday. Unfortunately not, Palmer replied. It relates directly to matters I believe you're currently discussing. He glanced at Mr. Abernathy, who was standing near the sideboard, still holding his portfolio. You must be Arthur Abernathy, executor of the Blackwell Trust. Mr. Abernathy looked startled to be addressed by name. I am. Have we met? No, but I've been corresponding with your office for several months. I represent Catherine Westbrook in matters relating to the Blackwell-Westbrook connection. The room seemed to tilt slightly as I processed his words. Blackwell-Westbrook connection? I repeated. What connection? Catherine moved further into the room, her gaze settling on me, with an intensity that was both assessing and strangely empathetic. I think it's time we cleared up some family history, don't you? She directed this not to me, but to Harrison, who had gone noticeably pale. This is hardly the time or place, he said stiffly. On the contrary, Catherine replied. From what I gathered outside the door, Vivienne has just called Madeline worthless despite learning she's a Blackwell heiress. I think that makes this exactly the right time and place. You were eavesdropping? Vivienne asked, outrage coloring her tone. Let's call it fortuitous timing, Catherine said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We arrived just in time to hear your charming assessment of your daughter-in-law. She turned to me again. Madeline, has anyone told you why I've been estranged from the Westbrook family for the past 30 years? I shook my head, struggling to keep up with this new development. Blake looked equally confused. Aunt Catherine left after a disagreement with grandfather, he said. Something about investment strategies, I was told. Catherine laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Is that the story they settled on? How delightfully sanitized. She moved to the table and pulled out a chair, sitting down as if planning to stay. The truth is somewhat more complicated. Catherine, Harrison warned, some matters are best left in the past. And some secrets poison families for generations, she countered. She looked directly at me. Madeline, did your grandmother ever mention the name Richard Westbrook to you? I searched my memory. I don't think so. Was that Harrison's father? His uncle, actually, Catherine replied. The elder brother of Harrison's father. He was meant to inherit everything, the company, the estate, the family position, until he fell in love with the wrong woman. A chill ran through me as connections began forming in my mind. A Blackwell woman? Eleanor Blackwell, Catherine confirmed. Your grandmother. The room spun around me. That's not possible, I said. My grandmother married William Cooper. They met in college. After, Catherine corrected gently. They met after she and Richard had ended their engagement. I looked to Mr. Abernathy for confirmation. He nodded slowly. It's true. Eleanor rarely spoke of it, but the family records confirm she was engaged to Richard Westbrook for nearly a year in 1952. But why would she never mention this? I asked, struggling to reconcile this new information with the grandmother I had known. Especially after I married Blake? Because the circumstances of their broken engagement were painful, Catherine explained. Richard was deeply in love with Eleanor by all accounts. They met at a charity function in Boston. She was just 20. He was 26 and already being groomed to take over Westbrook Financial from his father. Harrison's face had gone from pale to flushed. This is ancient history. It has no relevance to current family matters. On the contrary, Catherine replied. It explains everything about how Madeline has been treated since she married Blake. She turned back to me. Richard and Eleanor's engagement was opposed by both families. The Blackwells thought the Westbrooks were too nouveau riche, too eager for social climbing. The Westbrooks thought Eleanor was too independent, too intellectual, for the role of corporate wife. Sounds familiar, Blake muttered beside me. Despite the opposition, they planned to marry, Catherine continued, until Richard suddenly broke the engagement with no explanation. Eleanor was devastated. She left Boston society entirely, changed her social circle, and eventually met your grandfather. But why would Richard end things if they were in love? I asked. Catherine's expression hardened as she looked directly at Harrison. Because he was given an ultimatum by his father, end the engagement or be disinherited and replaced by his younger brother, Harrison's father, as heir to the Westbrook fortune, I felt Blake stiffen beside me. Grandfather forced Uncle Richard to choose between love and money? Just as the Blackwells tried to force Eleanor to choose, Mr. Abernathy added quietly. The difference was, Eleanor chose love when she later met William Cooper. Richard chose the inheritance. And regretted it for the rest of his life, Catherine said. He never married, became something of a recluse, drank too much, died relatively young. The great tragedy of the Westbrook family, or so I was told when I married into it. Vivienne, who had been uncharacteristically silent during this revelation, suddenly found her voice. This is absurd. Even if this ancient romance did happen, it has nothing to do with us now. Doesn't it? Catherine asked. When Blake brought home a woman with no apparent fortune or connections, who valued books and ideas over social position, just like Eleanor Blackwell, didn't that trigger something in the family consciousness? Especially in you, Harrison? All eyes turned to Harrison, whose composure had completely abandoned him. His hand shook slightly as he reached for his water glass. I never made the connection, he said hoarsely. Cooper is a common name, and Father rarely spoke of Uncle Richard after he died. But you grew up hearing the story, Catherine pressed. The cautionary tale of Richard Westbrook and his inappropriate love. The lesson that Westbrooks marry strategically, not for love. Isn't that what you said at Blake and Madeline's engagement dinner, Harrison? The exact words your father would use? Harrison didn't answer, but his expression confirmed Catherine's assertion. I felt as if I had stepped into someone else's life. My quiet, book-loving grandmother had once been engaged to Blake's great-uncle, had been rejected by him in favor of wealth and position, and now, by some cosmic coincidence or twist of fate, I had married into the very family that had broken her heart. "There's more," Catherine said, nodding to her attorney, who opened his briefcase. Richard Westbrook never stopped loving Eleanor. When he died, he left a separate trust of his personal fortune. Not the family money, but his own investments. This trust was established for the benefit of, and I quote, "Eleanor Blackwell, or her direct descendants, should they ever reconnect with the Westbrook family through marriage or other significant association." The revelation hung in the air, like suspended crystal. Beautiful, sharp-edged, and potentially dangerous depending on how it landed. "A second trust?" Mr. Abernathy asked, professional interest overcoming his surprise. "I was never informed of this." "It was kept separate from the Blackwell Trust by design," Jonathan Palmer explained. "Richard Westbrook wanted to ensure the funds wouldn't be blocked by either family. The trust has been managed independently, with instructions to monitor both family lines for any reconnection." "And the value?" Blake asked, his lawyer's mind going to the practical implications even, as he processed this extraordinary twist of fate. "Approximately $32 million in current valuation," Palmer replied. Richard was quite a successful investor in his own right, even separated from the main Westbrook enterprises. I sank back into my chair, overwhelmed. Not only was I heir to the Blackwell fortune through my grandmother, but also to a second fortune, from the man who had broken her heart but apparently never stopped loving her. "This is absurd," Vivienne said, though her voice had lost its cutting edge, replaced by something closer to bewilderment. "You expect us to believe that Blake coincidentally married the granddaughter of his great-uncle's lost love? That's the stuff of overwrought romance novels, not real life." "Statistical improbabilities occur every day," Catherine replied with a slight shrug, "though I doubt it was entirely coincidence. Blake and Madeline met at the annual Children's Hospital benefit, correct? The same event founded by Richard and Eleanor during their engagement, which both families have continued to support out of tradition, though likely forgetting its origins." Blake looked at me with new wonder. "The gala where we met. I was there representing the Westbrook Foundation. You were coordinating the silent auction," I finished. "My mother had volunteered there for years. She encouraged me to take the position when she became too ill to continue." "Patterns repeat in families," Catherine observed. "Sometimes over generations." Harrison cleared his throat. "Even if all this is true, what purpose does it serve to dredge up these old stories now? The past is past." "Is it?" Catherine challenged. "From what I overheard, Vivienne just called Madeline worthless at a family dinner. Essentially the same judgment the Westbrooks passed on Eleanor 70 years ago. The past seems very much present to me." Vivienne's face had lost all color. Whether from the revelations or the public exposure of her cruelty, she seemed suddenly diminished, her carefully constructed authority crumbling visibly. "I didn't know," she said faintly. "How could I have known?" "You couldn't have," I said, surprising myself with the lack of anger in my voice. "But that's not really the point, is it? You didn't need to know Eleanor's history to treat me with basic respect." I looked down at the envelope Mr. Abernathy had given me, still unopened in my hands. Eleanor's final words to me, written with the knowledge of all these connections I had never suspected. "May I?" I asked, gesturing with the letter. "Of course," Mr. Abernathy replied. "It's yours." With careful fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded the pages covered in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. The room fell silent as I began to read, first silently, then, compelled by some instinct I didn't fully understand, aloud. "My dearest Madeline, if you're reading this, then Arthur has fulfilled his obligation, and you now know about the Blackwell inheritance. I'm sorry for keeping this from you all these years, but I wanted you to become your own person, unburdened by expectations or assumptions that come with wealth and family names. What you may not yet know, though perhaps circumstances have revealed it by now, is that long before I met your grandfather, whom I loved deeply and truly, I was engaged to Richard Westbrook. Our love was genuine, but ultimately sacrificed to family expectations and financial considerations. Richard chose his inheritance over our future together, a decision I believe he regretted for the rest of his life, as I later learned he never married. When you told me you had fallen in love with Blake Westbrook, I was stunned by the symmetry of it. I considered warning you about the Westbrook family's values, their prioritization of wealth and status over happiness, but I saw in Blake something different, a reflection of the man Richard might have been if he'd made different choices. And I saw in you, my darling girl, the strength and clarity of purpose that I wish I'd had more of in my youth. I chose to keep my history silent to let your love story unfold without the shadow of mine hanging over it. The money that comes to you now is incidental. I never cared for it myself. But it does offer you something precious: freedom. The freedom to make choices based on your heart rather than necessity. The freedom to walk away from situations that diminish you. The freedom to build the life you truly want. Richard's separate. Trust, which I learned about years after your grandfather passed, was, I believe, his attempt at atonement. A way of saying that while he couldn't rewrite our story, perhaps he could help write a better ending for our descendants. Whatever has transpired at the reading of this letter, remember this: true worth has nothing to do with bank accounts or family names. It lives in how we treat others, the courage with which we face difficult truths, and the integrity we bring to our choices. You have always been my proudest achievement, Madeline, not because of anything you've accomplished, but because of who you are: kind, thoughtful, and unwilling to be diminished by others' limited perceptions. All my love always, Grandma Eleanor, Blackwell Cooper. As I finished reading, I realized tears were streaming down my face. Eleanor had known, perhaps not the specifics of how the Westbrooks would treat me, but she had anticipated the fundamental clash of values that would define my relationship with Blake's family. I looked up to find the entire table watching me, with varying expressions of discomfort, shock, and in Blake's case, a mix of pain and determination. "Well," Harrison said after a long moment, his businessman's instinct to take control reasserting itself, "this is certainly an unexpected development. I suggest we all take some time to process these revelations before making any hasty statements or decisions." "Actually," Blake said, standing and extending his hand to me, "I think Madeline and I need to leave now. We have a lot to discuss privately." I took his hand and rose, feeling strangely light despite the emotional weight of the evening. "Before we go," I said, finding a calm certainty in the midst of this chaos, "I want to be clear about something. I didn't know about the Blackwell money. I didn't know about Richard Westbrook's trust. I married Blake because I love him, and I've spent 5 years trying to be accepted by this family because he loves you." I looked directly at Vivienne, whose composure had completely abandoned her. "But that effort ends tonight. I won't be returning to this house or to any Westbrook family gathering where I'm not treated with basic respect, money or no money." Blake's hand tightened on mine in clear support. "I'm with Madeline," he said simply. "We'll be in touch about the legal aspects of these trusts, but otherwise, I think we need a period of separation from family events." As we moved toward the door, Eliza rose and hugged me quickly. "I'll call you tomorrow," she whispered, "and for what it's worth, I've always been on your side." Catherine Westbrook watched our departure with a slight smile. "History doesn't repeat," she murmured. "But it does rhyme. The difference is, this generation is making better choices." Outside in the crisp November air, Blake and I stood for a moment on the grand portico of the Westbrook mansion, the sounds of raised voices already emanating from the dining room behind us. "I'm sorry," Blake said, turning to face me. "For everything." they said, for everything I didn't say soon enough. For 5 years of letting them make you feel less than? It wasn't your fault, I replied, reaching up to touch his face. We were both trying to make something work that was built on shifting sand. What do we do now? He asked, and I could hear in his voice the weight of multiple questions about the money, about his family, about our future. I thought about Eleanor's letter, about the choices she had made and the ones she had hoped I would make. About Richard Westbrook, who had chosen wealth over love and spent a lifetime regretting it. About the strange symmetry of Blake and me finding each other across generations, perhaps finishing a story that had begun long before we were born. Now, I said, taking his hand as we walked toward our car, we figure out who we want to be with $80 million instead of who the Westbrooks want us to be. We figure out what matters to us, what we want to build together. As we drove away from the mansion, its windows glowing with light that no longer seemed warm or inviting, I felt a profound sense of liberation. Money hadn't created the problems in my relationship with the Westbrooks, and it wouldn't solve them. But what it had done, what Eleanor had perhaps intended all along, was to strip away pretenses and reveal the truth. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't counted in dollars or property. Sometimes it's the courage to stand in your truth and walk away from those who cannot see your worth. Eleanor had given me that gift long before I knew about the Blackwell millions, through years of quiet wisdom and unconditional love, and in honoring that legacy, the true wealth she had passed down to me, I was finally free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.